afternoon, class. So today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite childhood authors, Mildred Augustine, otherwise known as Carolyn Keene, from the famous Nancy Drew book series. She was born Mildred Augustine on July 10th, 1905, to Lillian and Dr. Jasper L. Augustine. She grew up with two sisters, Melville and Elwyn Augustine, and they all lived together in a small city in Iowa called Latera. Later, when Mildred grew up, she completed an English degree at the University of Iowa in 1925. She completed this degree in 3 years, which I think is really cool because some of you maybe have, but I personally took 4 years, and 3 years is a really good accomplishment to do that. She came back later, 2 years after that, to finish her master's degree in journalism and became the first woman from that college to complete the journalism master's. While she was finishing her master's in 1928, she married Asa Wirth, and together they had a daughter named Peggy in 1936. After 19 years of marriage, Asa passed away, and later that year in 1947, she married George A. Benson. They had no children together, but he was an editor at one of the publishing companies that she worked at, and he did help her get a job there when she was first starting out as an undergrad. Her undergraduate degree, while that was in progress, started her writing career, and Mildred was hired by Stratemeyer Syndicate. She got this job as a response to an ad for ghostwriters, which is a process used for companies when they have multiple authors working on a series at the same time. She worked for this company for over 20 years, almost 20 years, my bad. She worked for this company for almost 20 years, and during that time, she worked on projects such as Ruth Fielding and Her Great Scenario, which was her first writing project, the Dana Girl series, and Penny Parker books. Penny Parker books, she has been told to say that they were her favorite book series, and they're also the first series that she wrote under her own name instead of a pseudonym. So they were the first books to be marked with her name at the time, which was Mildred Benson. Nancy Drew and Carolyn Keene later came around as one of her most popular books, and her employer, Edward Stratemeyer, came up with the character Nancy Drew. He handed the writing and characterization over to Mildred, and she completed the works and the storylines based off of different scenarios that the company would give her to work with. She developed the characterization, she personalized Nancy Drew, and put a lot of herself into this book character. The pseudonym Carolyn Keene was created so as writers for different series came and went, the name of the book in association with the company would stay the same. Because of this, a lot of the series of books that she worked with had multiple authors, and as they came into the company or they left to work with other book series, the name would stay the same, so as not to confuse some of the people that would read them or collect them. It's just Carolyn Keene is associated with a lot of different series, and so to keep that steady and to keep the company associated with that name, they kept that pseudonym instead of using the author's real names at that time. Her name was discovered only because of a court case in 1980 about which publishing companies own the right to the series. There was a big scuffle over who owned those rights after Edward passed away, and so to use royalties and different things that were in his will, they transferred the rights to another company, and the company that previously owned it did not disagree. Later in life, in 2001, at 95 years old, Mildred Benson was awarded the Special Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America. This was in association to her Nancy Drew books. They became such a popular hit, she didn't even realize that they would have been, but she was so proud of these books and the influence they had on young girls, encouraging, at that time, what was not very popular. It was not in a lot of writings that the main character would be an adventurous girl. Female leads were not typical of books at the time. So for her to have written that series and for it to be so popular, it was very much awarded later in her life. Her favorite Nancy Drew book was The Hidden Staircase, and she was quoted in a lot of interviews and book signings as that she would only sign the Nancy Drew that she would only sign the Nancy Drew books that she was had a part in writing, since there were a lot of authors that wrote along with her in the later Nancy Drew books. She only wrote about 23 of the 30 Nancy Drew books, of the original Nancy Drew books. She continued writing in small parts of newspapers, and different publishing companies, mostly obituaries, as she became older and she had to settle down. At this time, her husband had passed away after 11 years of marriage, and that was in 1959. So she had a lot of time where she was single, she wasn't married. She spent a lot of time with her daughter and writing in newspapers. Writing was her passion, very much so. So a few months before she died, she stopped writing in the newspapers and publishing companies, and she passed away from lung cancer in 2002 at 96 years old. But leaving behind, she left a legacy of almost a dozen pseudonyms, writing different names of almost a dozen authorships. And she published over 130 books, which is spectacular. I have read a lot of her books, and they are really wonderful books, especially for that time period where the female characters were not very developed. She did a very wonderful job. So now I'm going to take a break from our lecture. You can set your notes down, and we will be reading her favorite book, The Hidden Staircase. I have this book. I have most of the collection of Nancy Drew books, so I was very excited to do this project today. So we're going to start at the very beginning. Chapter 1, The Haunted House. Nancy Drew began peeling off her garden gloves as she ran up the porch steps and into the hall to answer the ringing telephone. She picked it up and said, "Hello? Hi, Nancy, this is Helen." Although Helen Corning was nearly 3 years older than Nancy, the two girls were very close friends. "Are you tied up in a case?" Helen asked. "No. What's up? A mystery?" "Yes, a haunted house." Nancy sat down on the chair by the telephone. "Tell me more," the 18-year-old detective begged excitedly. "You've heard me speak of my Aunt Rosemary," Helen began. "Since becoming a widow, she has lived with her mother at Twin Elms, the old family mansion out in Cliffwood. Well, I went to see them yesterday. They said that many strange, mysterious things have been happening there recently. I told them how good you are at solving mysteries, and they'd like you to come out to Twin Elms and help them." Helen paused, out of breath. "It certainly sounds intriguing," Nancy replied, her eyes dancing. "If you're not busy, Aunt Rosemary and I would love you to come over in about an hour to talk to you about the ghost." "I can't wait." After Nancy had put down the phone, she sat lost in thought for several minutes. Since solving the secret of the old clock, she had longed for another case. Here was her chance. Attractive, blonde-haired Nancy was brought out of her daydreaming by the sound of the doorbell. At the same moment, the Drews' housekeeper, Hannah Gruen, came down the front stairs. "I'll answer it," she offered. Mrs. Gruen had lived with the Drews since Nancy was 3 years old. At that time, Mrs. Drew had passed away, and Hannah had become like a second mother to Nancy. There was a deep affection between the two, and Nancy confided all her secrets to the understanding housekeeper. Mrs. Gruen opened the door, and instantly a man stepped into the hall. He was short, thin, and rather stooped. Nancy guessed his age to be maybe 40. "Is Mr. Drew at home?" he asked brusquely. "My name is Gomber, Nathan Gomber." "No, he's not here just now," the housekeeper replied. The caller looked over Hannah Gruen's shoulder and stared at Nancy. "Are you Nancy Drew?" "Yes, I am. Is there anything I can do for you?" The man's shifty gaze moved from Nancy to Hannah. "I've come out of the goodness of my heart to warn you and your father," he said pompously. "Warn us? About what?" Nancy asked quickly. Nathan Gomber straightened up importantly and said, "Your father is in great danger, Miss Drew." Both Nancy and Hannah Gruen gasped. "You mean this very minute?" the housekeeper questioned. "All the time," was the startling answer. "I understand you're a pretty bright girl, Miss Drew, and you even solve mysteries. Well, right now, I advise you to stick close to your father. Don't leave him for a minute." Hannah Gruen looked as if she were ready to collapse and suggested they all go into the living room, sit down, and talk the matter over. When they were seated, Nancy asked Nathan Gomber to explain further. "The story in a nutshell is this," he began. "You know that your father was brought in to do legal work for the railroad when he was buying property for the new bridge here." As Nancy nodded, he continued. "Well, a lot of the folks who sold their property think they were gypped." Nancy's face reddened. "I understand from my father that everyone was well paid." "That's not true," said Goldmer. "Besides, the railroad is in a real mess right now. One of the property owners, whose deed and signature they claim to have, says that they never signed a contract of sale." "What's his name?" Nancy asked. "Willie Wharton." Nancy had not heard her father mention his name. She asked Gomber to go on with his story. "I'm acting as agent for Willie Wharton and several of the landowners who were his neighbors. He said they can make it pretty tough for the railroad. Willie Wharton's signature was never witnessed, and attached certificate of acknowledgement was not authorized. That's good proof the signature was a forgery. Well, if the railroad thinks they're going to get away with it, they're not." Nancy frowned. Such a procedure on the part of the property owner meant trouble for her father, she said evenly. But all Willie Wharton has to do is swear before a notary that he did sign the contract of sale. Gomber chuckled. It's not that easy, Miss Drew. Willie Wharton is not available. Some of us have a good idea where he is, and we'll produce him at the right time. But that time won't be until the railroad promises to give the sellers more money. Then he'll sign. You see, Willie is a really kind man, and he wants to help his friends out whenever he can. Now he's got a chance. Nancy had taken an instant dislike to Gomer, and now it was quadrupled. She judged him to be the kind of person who stays within the boundaries of the law, but whose ethics are questionable. This was indeed a tough problem for Mr. Drew. Who are the people who are apt to harm my father? She asked. I'm not saying who they are. And I guess we'll have to find out when Nancy does, because we are out of time for today. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed the first part of the first chapter of the second book in the Nancy Drew book series, and we'll come back to read it later and find out who are all the people that want to hurt Nancy's dad and what the mystery of the haunted house is.